The Appalachian forest was alive with the whispers of early autumn. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting a mosaic of shadows on the forest floor. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. Dr. Emily Carter paused on the narrow trail, her boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves. She knelt to examine the moss-covered roots of an old oak tree, her fingers brushing gently over the soil as she searched for signs of amphibian life. Behind her, Nate, a young intern with boundless enthusiasm and a camera perpetually slung around his neck, struggled to keep up. His foot caught on a root, and he stumbled, narrowly avoiding a fall. "Careful, Nate," Emily said without looking up. "This forest can be unforgiving if you're not paying attention." "Noted," Nate replied, straightening his jacket and adjusting the camera strap. "But you've got to admit, this place is incredible. It feels like stepping back in time." Emily smiled faintly. "It does, doesn't it? There's a reason they call it one of the most biodiverse regions in the country. Every step here feels like uncovering a secret." The forest wasn't just a research site for Emily. It was a living, breathing archive of stories, some written in the twisted bark of trees and others in the faint trails left by creatures most people never noticed. Today, her focus was on frogs, specifically the ghost frog, a species thought to have been extinct for 3 decades. It was an elusive creature, known for its translucent skin and hauntingly delicate call, often described as the sound of wind whistling through hollow reeds. As a child, Emily had been captivated by her grandfather's stories about the ghost frog. He'd been a renowned herpetologist, spending his later years searching for the species long after others had given up. His obsession with finding it had become a family legend, though Emily remembered it differently, not as an obsession, but as a deep love for the natural world. Now, as an adult, Emily carried on his legacy, though she often questioned if she would ever find what she was looking for. Decades of deforestation had stripped much of the ghost frog's known habitat, and most scientists had written it off as another tragic casualty of environmental destruction. Ahead of her on the trail, Dan, a seasoned park ranger assigned to accompany them, walked with an air of skepticism. His years in the forest had made him cautious, and while he respected Emily's dedication, he found her quest for the ghost frog overly idealistic. "Dr. Carter," Dan called back to her, stopping to lean on his walking stick. "How long are we planning to be out here? The sun's going to set in a few hours, and I'd rather not be stumbling around this place in the dark." Emily rose from her crouch, brushing dirt off her hands. "We'll head back before dusk. But this is exactly the time of day we're most likely to find them, so keep your eyes open." Nate perked up. "Do you really think there's a chance we could find one today?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "If they're still out there, this is the kind of environment they'd thrive in. The stream we're heading to matches every description I've read in the old records. And," she paused, glancing at Nate, "I have a good feeling about today." Dan rolled his eyes but said nothing, choosing instead to scan the trail ahead. "Good feelings don't bring frogs back from extinction," he muttered under his breath. The group continued deeper into the forest, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they approached the stream. When they arrived, Emily's breath caught. The stream was pristine, its crystal-clear waters winding through a bed of smooth stones and moss. Overhanging branches created a canopy that dappled the water with light. Emily knelt at the edge of the stream, her eyes scanning the shallow water. Nate crouched beside her, snapping photos of the vibrant moss and small insects darting across the surface. "What exactly are we looking for?" Nate asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the serenity of the scene. "Eggs," Emily replied. "Or even a single frog. The ghost frog's eggs are unique. They're translucent and smaller than most other amphibian eggs in this region. If we're lucky, we might find a cluster attached to rocks or plants underwater." Dan stood a few feet away, his arms crossed. "I don't mean to be the pessimist here, but don't you think it's strange that no one's seen this frog in 30 years? Seems to me if it were still around, someone would have stumbled across it by now." Emily looked up at him, her expression calm but resolute. "That's the thing about extinction, Dan. Sometimes we declare it too soon. We give up before we've looked hard enough." As she spoke, a faint sound reached her ears. It was so soft and distant that she thought she might have imagined it, a delicate, airy croak that seemed to blend with the whisper of the stream. Emily froze, her eyes widening. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Nate glanced around, confused. "Hear what?" Emily held up a hand, signaling for silence. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, a haunting, almost melodic croak that sent a shiver down her spine. Dan straightened, his skeptical expression fading into one of curiosity. "That didn't sound like any frog I've heard before," he admitted. Emily stood slowly, her heart pounding. "It's the ghost frog," she said, her voice barely audible. "It has to be." She took a cautious step toward the stream, her eyes scanning the water's edge. The sound grew fainter, then disappeared entirely, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Emily turned to the others, her excitement tempered by frustration. "It's close," she said. "I know it is." Dan frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked past the stream. "We're not alone," he said, his voice low. Emily followed his gaze and froze. On the far side of the stream, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure, a man, standing motionless and watching them. He was too far away to make out any details, but his presence was unmistakable. "Who's that?" Nate whispered, his voice trembling. Dan stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. "Stay here," he ordered, his tone firm. "I'll handle this." As Dan moved toward the figure, Emily felt a chill run through her. The forest, which had felt so alive moments ago, now seemed heavy with an unspoken tension. She glanced at Nate, who was gripping his camera tightly. "Keep filming," she said quietly. "Whatever happens, we need to document this." The figure turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only the faint rustle of leaves. Dan stopped at the stream's edge, his shoulders tense. When he returned, his expression was grim. "He's gone," he said. "But something tells me we're not the only ones searching for the ghost frog." The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the Appalachian forest in shades of deep orange and purple. The group sat around a small campfire near their makeshift campsite, its flickering flames casting long shadows against the towering trees. The mood was tense. The mysterious figure from earlier lingered in everyone's thoughts, but no one seemed eager to bring it up. Instead, they focused on the day's discoveries, or lack thereof. Nate busied himself adjusting his camera, occasionally snapping candid shots of the firelight reflecting off Emily's thoughtful expression. She was staring into the flames, her mind racing with possibilities. The sound they'd heard, could it really have been the ghost frog? And if so, why hadn't they been able to find it? Dan broke the silence, his gruff voice cutting through the crackling of the fire. "You still think it's out there?" He leaned back against his log seat, arms crossed. Emily nodded without hesitation. "I know what I heard, Dan. Frogs have unique calls, and that was unlike anything I've ever encountered before." Dan chuckled dryly. "And what about our visitor? You think he's out here chasing frogs too?" Nate, who had been silent until now, looked up from his camera. "Who was he, anyway? A local? A poacher?" Dan shrugged. "Hard to say. Could have been a hunter, a drifter, or someone who doesn't like people poking around his woods." Emily frowned. "Whoever he is, he seemed to know we were here. That wasn't a chance encounter. And the way he vanished, it's like he knew the forest better than anyone." Nate leaned forward, his voice tinged with excitement. "What if he knows something about the ghost frog? Maybe he's seen it and doesn't want us to find it. Or maybe," Dan interjected, "he doesn't care about frogs at all and just wants us gone." The conversation lapsed into silence again, the crackle of the fire filling the void. Emily's gaze drifted to the notebook resting on her lap. It was her grandfather's journal, a weathered leather-bound book filled with sketches, notes, and observations from decades ago. She flipped through the pages, her fingers pausing on a drawing of the ghost frog, a delicate, translucent creature with intricate markings along its back. "This was his life's work," Emily said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "He spent years searching for this frog, even when everyone else gave up." "I can't let it end here." Nate shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think he would have wanted you to risk all this? I mean, with the loggers moving in and now, mysterious strangers." Emily looked up, her eyes meeting Nate's. "It's not about what he would have wanted. It's about what's right. If the ghost frog is still out there, it deserves a chance to survive. And we can't let anything, or anyone, get in the way of that." Dan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I respect what you're trying to do, but you need to be realistic. This forest isn't some untouched paradise. There's more at stake here than just a frog." "Exactly," Emily shot back. That's why we have to act now. If we wait, this habitat could be gone forever. And with it, any chance of saving the ghost frog. Dan didn't respond, his expression unreadable. He stared into the fire for a long moment before finally standing. I'm going to check the perimeter. You two try to get some rest. We've got a long day ahead. As Dan disappeared into the shadows, Nate turned to Emily, lowering his voice. Do you really think we'll find it? The ghost frog, I mean. Emily smiled faintly. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Later that night, the forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Emily lay in her tent, staring up at the fabric roof, her mind too restless to let her sleep. She replayed the croak in her head, each note echoing with a mix of hope and frustration. If it was the ghost frog, why hadn't they seen it? Was it watching them, just out of reach? Suddenly, a faint noise broke through her thoughts, a rustling sound, faint but deliberate. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. She unzipped her tent quietly and peered out into the moonlit forest. Nate's tent was still, the soft glow of his camera battery indicator visible through the fabric. Dan was nowhere in sight. The rustling came again, this time closer. Emily grabbed her flashlight and stepped out of the tent, the cool night air prickling her skin. She scanned the area, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. Dan, she called softly. Is that you? No response. She took a cautious step forward, her boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves. The rustling sound grew louder, coming from the direction of the stream. Emily hesitated, glancing back at the camp before deciding to follow it. As she approached the stream, the sound stopped. Emily stood frozen, her flashlight beam sweeping across the water's edge. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a faint movement among the rocks. Her heart leapt as she crouched down, adjusting the light. There, partially hidden by moss and shadow, was a frog. Its translucent skin glimmered in the light, and intricate patterns swirled along its back like delicate brushstrokes. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It's you, she whispered. You're real. She reached for her camera, fumbling in her pocket, but the frog leapt away before she could capture the moment. Emily's flashlight followed its path, but it disappeared into the undergrowth, leaving her with nothing but the memory of its fleeting presence. Emily sank back onto her heels, a mixture of elation and frustration coursing through her. She had seen it, the ghost frog was alive. But without evidence, she knew her discovery would be little more than a story. When she returned to camp, Dan was sitting by the fire, his expression grim. You were gone a while, he said, his tone laced with suspicion. I saw it, Emily replied, her voice steady. The ghost frog. It's real. Dan raised an eyebrow. You're sure? I'm sure, she said firmly. But it got away before I could document it. Nate emerged from his tent, rubbing his eyes. What's going on? Emily turned to him, her determination renewed. We're not leaving until we find it again. This changes everything. The morning sun crept through the dense canopy of the forest, illuminating the camp with a golden glow. Emily was already awake, seated by the dying embers of last night's fire, scribbling notes in her grandfather's journal. Her mind replayed the sight of the ghost frog from the night before. Its translucent body, the delicate markings on its back. It had to be real. She had seen it with her own eyes. Nate emerged from his tent, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. You're up early, he said, stifling a yawn. Did you even sleep? Emily shook her head. Not much. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Nate, it was right there, just a few feet away. I saw it. Nate sat beside her, his camera already in hand. So, what's the plan? Do we go back to the stream and try again? Before Emily could answer, Dan appeared from the edge of the camp, carrying a bundle of firewood. We need to talk, he said, his tone more serious than usual. Emily raised an eyebrow. About what? Dan set the firewood down and crossed his arms. About that figure we saw yesterday. I don't like it. Someone's out here, and we don't know who they are or what they want. That's a problem. Emily sighed. I get it, Dan, but we can't let that distract us. We're here for the ghost frog. And what if whoever's out there doesn't want us here? Dan countered. What if they're willing to do something about it? Then we'll deal with it when the time comes, Emily said firmly. Right now, Our priority is finding evidence." Dan shook his head but didn't argue further. He could see the determination in Emily's eyes, and he knew she wouldn't back down. By mid-morning, the group was back at the stream. Emily directed Nate to photograph the surrounding area while she carefully searched the water's edge. Dan stood watch a few yards away, his hand resting on the radio at his belt. Emily knelt by a cluster of moss-covered rocks, her eyes scanning every inch for signs of life. Suddenly, she froze. "Nate," she whispered urgently. "Over here." Nate hurried over, his camera at the ready. Emily pointed to a cluster of tiny, translucent eggs attached to a submerged plant. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "Those are ghost frog eggs. They have to be." Nate crouched beside her, adjusting his camera to capture the perfect shot. "This is incredible," he said. "We've got evidence." Emily carefully documented the discovery, taking measurements and writing detailed notes in her journal. She felt a surge of hope. This was the breakthrough they needed. But as they worked, a faint noise reached their ears. It was a low, rhythmic sound, growing louder with each passing second. Emily looked up, her heart sinking. "Chainsaws," Dan said grimly, stepping closer. "The loggers are moving in." Emily stood, her mind racing. "We have to stop them. If they clear this area, the ghost frog's habitat will be destroyed." Dan shook his head. "You can't just march up to them and demand they stop. They've got permits." "I don't care," Emily snapped. "This is too important." The group made their way toward the sound, weaving through the dense forest until they reached a clearing. A team of loggers was working methodically, their chainsaws roaring as they felled tree after tree. Trucks were already loaded with timber, ready to transport the spoils of the forest. Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Excuse me," she called, raising her voice over the noise. One of the loggers, a burly man with a hard hat and a clipboard, turned to face her. "This is a restricted area," he said gruffly. "You're not supposed to be here." "This area is home to a critically endangered species," Emily said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You can't just destroy it." The man snorted. "We've got permits, lady. If you've got a problem, take it up with the forestry department." Emily clenched her fists, her frustration mounting. "I have photographic evidence. I'll take this to the media if I have to." The man narrowed his eyes. "Do what you want. We're not stopping." Dan stepped forward, his presence imposing. "She's right," he said firmly. "This area needs to be protected. If you keep working here, you're risking serious consequences." The logger hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "I'm just doing my job. If you want to fight this, you'll need to go higher up." Defeated but not deterred, the group retreated to their camp. Emily was fuming, pacing back and forth as she tried to come up with a plan. "We need more evidence," she said finally. "If we can prove the ghost frog is here, we'll have a stronger case." "And how do we do that?" Dan asked, his skepticism evident. "We find the frog," Emily said simply, "and we document everything." That night, the group returned to the stream, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy with tension, each sound amplified by the stillness of the forest. Emily led the way, her eyes scanning every shadow, every ripple in the water. Suddenly, Nate froze. "Over there," he whispered, pointing to a nearby rock. Emily followed his gaze and saw it, a ghost frog, its translucent body glowing faintly in the moonlight. She held her breath, afraid to move and scare it away. "Get the camera," she whispered. Nate raised his camera, his hands trembling as he adjusted the focus. The shutter clicked, capturing the frog in stunning detail. But before they could celebrate, a branch snapped nearby. Emily turned sharply, her flashlight sweeping across the forest. The figure from before was back, standing just beyond the tree line, watching them. Dan stepped forward, his hand on his radio. "Hey," he called. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move, but Emily noticed something strange. He wasn't alone. There was a dog by his side, its eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam. "Stay here," Dan said, moving cautiously toward the figure. Emily and Nate exchanged a nervous glance, their excitement over the ghost frog overshadowed by the mysterious presence. Dan reached the tree line, but the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing once again. The dog lingered for a moment before following its master, leaving behind only the faint sound of rustling leaves. Dan returned to the group, his expression grim. Whoever he is, he doesn't want us here. Emily's determination only grew stronger. Then we'd better work fast, she said. We've got the evidence we need, but we can't stop now. We have to protect this place. As the group made their way back to camp, Emily's mind was already racing with ideas. The ghost frog was real, and she had the proof. But with the loggers closing in and an unknown figure watching their every move, the fight to save the forest was only just beginning. The forest was still as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. The group had barely slept, their minds racing with the events of the previous night. Emily sat on a fallen log, holding Nate's camera in her hands. The photograph of the ghost frog was clear and unmistakable. Its translucent skin and intricate markings were exactly as described in her grandfather's journal. "This is it," Emily said quietly, staring at the screen. "This is the proof we needed." Nate, still groggy but equally excited, leaned over to look at the photo. "It's incredible," he said. "No one can deny it now. The ghost frog is alive." Dan, standing a few feet away, wasn't as convinced. "It's a start," he said, his arms crossed. "But one photo isn't going to stop the loggers. We need more than this." Emily looked up at him, determination etched on her face. "Then we'll get more. We'll document the eggs, the habitat, everything, and we'll use it to build a case to protect this forest." Dan sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't get it, do you? The loggers aren't going to stop just because we found a frog. This is about money, permits, and contracts. You're up against a system that doesn't care about endangered species." "Then we'll make them care," Emily shot back. "We'll take this to the media, to conservation groups, to anyone who will listen. But we can't do that until we have enough evidence." Dan didn't respond, but the doubt in his eyes was clear. By mid-morning, the group had split up to cover more ground. Emily and Nate returned to the stream to document the eggs they had found the previous day, while Dan scouted the perimeter of the forest, keeping an eye out for the mysterious figure who had been watching them. At the stream, Emily knelt by the water's edge, carefully sketching the egg cluster in her journal while Nate snapped photos from various angles. The light filtering through the trees cast a serene glow over the scene, but Emily's focus was sharp. Every detail mattered. "These eggs are a game changer," Emily said, her voice tinged with excitement. "They prove the frogs are breeding, which means this habitat is critical for their survival." Nate nodded, adjusting his camera settings. "It's amazing to think they've been here all this time, hidden in plain sight." As they worked, a sudden noise made them both freeze. It was faint but distinct, the sound of a branch snapping underfoot. Emily looked up, her eyes scanning the dense foliage. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Nate nodded, gripping his camera tightly. "Do you think it's him?" Emily stood slowly, her heart pounding. "Stay here," she said, her voice firm. "I'll check it out." "No way," Nate replied, standing as well. "If you're going, I'm going." Before Emily could protest, another sound reached their ears, this time closer. It was the rustling of leaves, deliberate and steady. The two of them turned toward the source of the noise, their breath caught in their throats. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was the same man they had seen before, his weathered face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. At his side was a dog, its coat a patchwork of brown and white. The man's gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Emily asked, her voice firm but not unkind. The man didn't answer immediately. He took a step closer, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor. When he spoke, his voice was low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This forest isn't safe." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" "We're here to study the wildlife, to protect it." The man shook his head. "You don't understand. There are things in this forest, things you don't want to mess with." "Like what?" Nate asked, his voice tinged with nervous curiosity. The man's eyes narrowed. "Just stay away from the stream," he said, "and keep your distance from the loggers. They're not as friendly as I am." Before Emily could respond, the man turned and walked away, his dog following closely at his heels. Within moments, he had disappeared into the trees, leaving Emily and Nate standing in stunned silence. When they returned to camp, Dan was waiting for them, his expression grim. "What happened?" he asked. Emily recounted the encounter with the man, her frustration evident. "He's hiding something," she said. "He knows more about this forest than he's letting on." Dan nodded. "I saw him too, near the logging site. He was watching them, just like he was watching us. Do you think he's working with the loggers?" Nate asked. "Doubt it," Dan replied. "He doesn't seem like the type. But whatever his deal is, we need to be careful." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Careful or not, we have to keep going. We're getting closer, I can feel it." That evening, the group gathered around the campfire to review their findings. Emily spread out her sketches and notes, while Nate displayed the photos he had taken. The image of the ghost frog glowed on the screen, its delicate features captured in perfect detail. "This is just the beginning," Emily said, her voice filled with determination. "Tomorrow, we'll head deeper into the forest. There's more to find, I'm sure of it." Dan frowned. "Deeper into the forest means closer to the loggers. Are you sure that's a good idea?" "It's the only option," Emily replied. "If we want to save this habitat, we have to document everything." Dan didn't argue, but his expression remained cautious. As the fire died down and the forest grew quiet, Emily sat alone, staring at the stars. Her grandfather's journal rested on her lap, its pages worn but full of wisdom. She flipped to a page with a sketch of the ghost frog, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. "We're so close," she whispered. "I just hope it's enough." The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Nate approaching, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her. Emily shook her head. "Too much on my mind." Nate nodded, staring into the darkness. "Do you ever wonder if your grandfather felt like this? Like he was chasing something impossible?" "Every day," Emily said with a small smile. "But he never gave up. And neither will I." Nate didn't respond, but his presence was comforting. For a moment, the weight of their mission felt a little lighter. The night passed without incident, but the next morning brought new challenges. As the group prepared to set out, they heard the unmistakable sound of chainsaws in the distance. The loggers were moving closer, their machines tearing through the forest with brutal efficiency. Emily's heart sank. "We have to hurry," she said, her voice firm. "Every second counts." Dan nodded, his skepticism replaced by a newfound resolve. "Then let's get to work." As they headed deeper into the forest, the tension was palpable. The ghost frog was real, but proving its existence would be a race against time, and against forces that seemed determined to stop them. The air in the Appalachian forest was thick with tension. The team had spent the morning carefully navigating deeper into the woods, each step carrying them further from the relative safety of their camp. The sound of distant chainsaws was a constant reminder of the urgency of their mission. Emily, with her grandfather's journal tucked securely in her pack, led the group with quiet determination. Behind her, Nate carried his camera, occasionally stopping to photograph the forest's striking beauty. Dan brought up the rear, his watchful eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. As they approached a clearing, Emily paused, raising a hand to signal the others to stop. The ground ahead was covered in soft moss, and a gentle slope led down to what appeared to be an isolated pond. The water was impossibly still, reflecting the overhanging trees like a mirror. "This is it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is exactly the kind of environment they thrive in." Nate crouched beside her, adjusting the settings on his camera. "It's beautiful," he said. "But do you really think we'll find them here?" Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the water. "If the ghost frog is anywhere, it's here." The group carefully descended the slope, their movements slow and deliberate. Emily's heart raced as she scanned the pond's edges for any signs of life. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then she saw it. Perched on a moss-covered rock near the water's edge was a ghost frog. Its translucent skin glimmered faintly in the dappled sunlight, and its intricate markings seemed almost otherworldly. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Nate," she whispered urgently. "There. Do you see it?" Nate followed her gaze, his eyes widening. "Oh my God," he murmured, raising his camera. "It's real." The shutter clicked softly as Nate captured photo after photo. Emily knelt slowly, careful not to startle the frog. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching, her hands trembling with excitement. Dan, standing a few feet away, watched in silence. For the first time, his skepticism seemed to waver. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "You were right." Emily didn't respond. She was too focused on the frog, her mind racing with thoughts of what this discovery could mean. This was more than just a breakthrough. It was a lifeline for the species and for the forest itself. As they worked, the sound of chainsaws grew louder, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Emily's stomach churned. The loggers were getting closer, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they reached this area. "We have to move fast," she said, her voice tense. "Nate, keep taking pictures. Dan, can you mark the location on the map? We'll need to include it in the report." Dan nodded, pulling out a crumpled map and marking the spot with a pen. "Got it," he said. "But we need to talk about what happens next. The loggers aren't going to stop just because we found a frog." Emily stood, her jaw set. "Then we'll make sure they have no choice. Once we have enough evidence, we'll take this to the authorities, to the media, anyone who can help." Nate glanced nervously at the tree line. "And what about him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily followed his gaze. The mysterious man was back, standing just beyond the clearing. He was watching them again, his expression unreadable. The dog sat at his feet, its ears perked. Dan stepped forward, his hand resting on the radio at his belt. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll handle this." Emily and Nate watched as Dan approached the man, his posture tense. The two exchanged words, their conversation too quiet to hear. After a few moments, Dan returned, his expression grim. "Well?" Emily asked. "What did he say?" Dan shook his head. "Not much. Just told us to leave. He said this forest doesn't belong to us." Emily frowned. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know," Dan admitted. "But I don't think he's working with the loggers. If anything, he seems more concerned about them than about us." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the group decided to head back to camp. The discovery of the ghost frog was a triumph, but it was clear that their work was far from over. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew more than he was letting on. That night, as the fire crackled softly, Emily reviewed their findings. Nate's photos were stunning, capturing the ghost frog in exquisite detail. Emily's sketches and notes painted a clear picture of the species' habitat and behavior. Together, the evidence was compelling. But the looming threat of the loggers cast a shadow over their success. Emily knew that time was running out, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were being watched. In the middle of the night, Emily was jolted awake by a noise outside her tent. It was faint but distinct, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps on the forest floor. She sat up, her heart pounding, and reached for her flashlight. "Dan." "Nate," she called quietly, unzipping her tent. The camp was still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Emily scanned the area, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rustling came again, this time closer. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. From the shadows, the dog emerged, its eyes reflecting the light. Emily froze, her grip tightening on the flashlight. A moment later, the man stepped into view, his expression calm but serious. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. Emily stood, her heart racing. "Why? What are you so afraid of?" The man didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the tents, then back at Emily. "This forest has secrets," he said finally. "Some of them are better left alone." Emily frowned, her frustration mounting. "I'm not leaving until we finish what we came here to do." The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "If that's your choice, so be it. But be careful. The loggers aren't the only threat out here." Before Emily could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. The dog lingered for a moment, watching her with curious eyes before following its master. When morning came, Emily shared the encounter with Dan and Nate. Dan's expression darkened as he listened, his protective instincts kicking in. "We need to keep moving," he said. "The longer we stay in one place, the more vulnerable we are." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's get to work. We're not leaving until we've done everything we can to save this forest." As they packed up their gear and prepared to venture deeper into the woods, Emily couldn't shake the man's words from her mind. The forest had secrets, he had said, and she was determined to uncover them all. The dawn broke over the forest with an uneasy stillness. The sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves were softer, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Emily awoke to the faint hum of distant machinery, chainsaws starting up for another day of destruction. The urgency of their mission pressed heavily on her chest as she emerged from her tent. Nate was already awake, organizing his camera equipment, while Dan stood by the campfire, his face lined with worry. "We don't have much time," Emily said, breaking the silence. "If the loggers get any closer, they'll destroy everything, including the ghost frog's habitat." Dan turned to face her, his expression grim. "It's not just the loggers we have to worry about. That man, he's still out there, watching us. I don't trust him." "We'll deal with him if we have to," Emily replied firmly. "But right now, our focus is on gathering more evidence." Nate looked up from his camera. "We already have the photos and notes. What else do we need?" Emily glanced at her grandfather's journal, which she had left open on the log by the fire. "Behavioral data," she said. "If we can observe the frogs in their natural environment, how they move, where they feed, how they interact, we'll have a stronger case. It's not just about proving they exist, it's about showing why this habitat is critical." Dan sighed. "You're playing with fire, Emily. The more time we spend out here, the more risks we take." "I know," she said, her voice softening. "But this is our only chance. If we don't act now, it'll be too late." The group packed up their gear and set out toward the pond where they had seen the ghost frog the previous day. The forest felt different now, tenser, more alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, seemed amplified. Emily led the way, her eyes scanning the ground for signs of the frogs or their eggs. Behind her, Nate walked quietly, his camera at the ready, while Dan brought up the rear, his hand resting on the radio at his belt. When they reached the pond, the sight that greeted them made Emily's heart sink. The water's edge was littered with debris, broken branches, tire tracks, and the unmistakable marks of heavy machinery. The loggers had been here. "No," Emily whispered, dropping to her knees by the water. She ran her fingers through the mud, searching for any sign of the eggs they had found before. But they were gone, trampled and buried under the weight of the destruction. Nate crouched beside her, his face pale. "What do we do now?" Emily clenched her fists, her mind racing. "We keep looking," she said finally. "There has to be another spot, another pond or stream where they've moved." Dan frowned, his gaze fixed on the tree line. "Or maybe they're gone for good," he muttered. Emily shot him a sharp look. "Don't say that. They're out there." "I know they are." The group pressed on, following the stream deeper into the forest. The terrain grew rougher, the trees denser, but Emily refused to slow down. Every now and then, she stopped to examine the ground, searching for tracks or other signs of the frogs. Hours passed, and the tension among the group grew. Finally, they reached a second clearing. This one was smaller than the first, with a narrow stream cutting through the center. Emily knelt by the water's edge, her heart leaping as she spotted a familiar glimmer among the rocks. "There," she said, pointing. "Look." Nate and Dan joined her, their eyes following her finger. Nestled among the moss was another ghost frog. It was smaller than the one they had seen before, but just as beautiful, its translucent body glowing faintly in the dappled sunlight. Nate raised his camera, capturing the moment in a series of rapid shots. "Got it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "This is incredible." Emily smiled, her hope rekindled. "We're not done yet. Keep looking. There might be more." As they searched the clearing, Emily noticed something unusual. The plants near the water's edge were wilted, their leaves tinged with an unnatural yellow. She crouched to examine them, her brow furrowing. "This isn't normal," she said. "Something's poisoning the water." Dan joined her, his expression darkening. "Could be runoff from the logging site," he said. "Chemicals, oil, who knows?" Emily felt a surge of anger. They're not just destroying the forest, they're killing everything in it. The discovery of the poisoned water added a new layer of urgency to their mission. Emily decided to take samples, carefully filling vials with water and sealing them in her pack. Meanwhile, Nate continued photographing the frogs, capturing every detail of their habitat. As the group worked, a shadow fell over the clearing. Emily looked up, her heart sinking as she recognized the man standing at the edge of the trees. The dog was with him, its ears perked and its gaze fixed on the group. Dan stepped forward, his hand on his radio. "What do you want?" he called. The man didn't answer. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." Emily stood, her hands clenched into fists. "We're not leaving," she said firmly. "This forest is home to an endangered species, and we're here to protect it." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think you're helping, but you're not. The more noise you make, the more attention you draw, and that puts everything at risk." Emily frowned, her frustration mounting. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The man hesitated, his gaze flickering to the dog before returning to Emily. "I'm the one who's been keeping this place safe," he said. "But I can't protect it if you keep drawing the loggers closer." Dan stepped closer, his posture tense. "So you're just going to let them destroy everything? That's your plan?" The man shook his head. "I have my own plan, but it doesn't involve outsiders stirring up trouble." Emily took a step forward, her voice rising. "We're not outsiders. We're scientists, and we're here to save this forest." The man's expression hardened. "Then you'd better move fast, because they're coming." The man and his dog disappeared into the trees, leaving the group in stunned silence. Emily turned to Dan, her jaw set. "We can't stop now. We have to finish what we started." Dan nodded reluctantly. "But we need to be smart about it. If they catch us out here, they'll shut us down for good." Emily glanced at the stream, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll be smart. But we're not giving up." As the group packed up their gear and prepared to move, Emily felt a mix of fear and determination. The stakes had never been higher, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let the ghost frog disappear again. Not without a fight. The Appalachian forest seemed darker than usual as the group pressed forward. The air was heavy, the usual sounds of nature muted under the weight of their mission. Emily led the way, her pack heavier than before with the water samples and notes they'd collected. Every step deeper into the forest felt like a race against time, against the loggers, the poisoned water, and the mysterious man who had warned them to leave. Behind her, Nate adjusted his camera, occasionally stopping to snap photos of the increasingly scarred landscape. Dan followed silently, his hand never straying far from his radio. The tension between the three was palpable, but no one wanted to voice their fears. They all knew that this might be their last chance to gather the evidence they needed to save the ghost frog. By midday, they reached a new clearing. This one was different, larger, with an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. The stream here was wider, but the water was murky, its surface reflecting the gray sky above. Emily knelt by the bank, her fingers brushing the damp soil. "This doesn't feel right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The water's stagnant. It shouldn't be like this." Nate crouched beside her, his camera at the ready. "Do you think it's from the logging? Chemicals, maybe?" "Could be," Emily replied. "Or it could be runoff from the machines. Either way, it's bad news for the frogs." Dan, who had been scanning the tree line, spoke up. "We're not alone." Emily and Nate looked up sharply. Dan was staring into the trees, his posture tense. Emily followed his gaze, but saw nothing. "What is it?" she asked. Dan didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his radio. "I thought I saw movement. Could be him again." "The man?" Nate asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Why won't he leave us alone?" Emily stood, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe he knows something we don't. Or maybe he's trying to scare us off." Dan turned back to face them. "Either way, we need to stay alert. This isn't just about the frogs anymore." The group continued deeper into the forest, the air growing colder as the afternoon wore on. Emily's focus was split between the environment around her and the growing sense of unease that gnawed at her. The forest, once vibrant and alive, now felt hostile, its shadows darker, its silence heavier. As they rounded a bend in the stream, Emily froze. Ahead of them, the trees opened up into another clearing, but this one was filled with devastation. The ground was churned up, the stream diverted into a narrow trench, and the air reeked of oil and smoke. Heavy machinery sat idle near the edge of the clearing, their massive tracks carving deep scars into the earth. Nate let out a low whistle. "They've been busy," he said grimly. Emily's stomach churned. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "If they keep this up, there won't be anything left for the frogs, or any other species." Dan surveyed the area, his jaw clenched. "We need to move carefully. If they catch us here, they'll shut us down for good." Emily nodded, but her heart was racing. She motioned for the group to follow her, leading them along the edge of the clearing where the trees provided some cover. As they moved, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The group's progress was slow, but eventually, they reached a point where the stream rejoined its natural path. Here, the water was clearer, and the forest felt a little more alive. Emily knelt by the bank, her spirits lifting as she spotted another cluster of ghost frog eggs clinging to a submerged rock. "They're still holding on," she said, her voice filled with both relief and determination. "We have to protect this." Nate began photographing the eggs, his movements careful and deliberate. Dan kept watch, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of danger. But the longer they stayed, the more uneasy he became. "We need to wrap this up," Dan said finally. "We've been here too long." Emily nodded, but as she stood, a sound reached her ears, a low rumbling noise that sent a chill down her spine. She turned toward the source, her heart sinking as she saw the loggers' machines starting up in the distance. "They're moving in," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We have to go." The group retreated back into the forest, their pace quickening as the sound of machinery grew louder. Emily's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. They had evidence, the photos, the notes, the water samples, but she knew it might not be enough. They needed more time, more proof. As they neared the camp, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was the man, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. The dog was at his side, its ears flat and its eyes wary. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low but firm. "They're getting closer." "We know," Emily replied, her frustration boiling over. "But we're not leaving. Not until we finish what we came here to do." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think you can save this forest? Save the frogs? You're fighting a battle you can't win." "Maybe," Emily said. "But that doesn't mean we won't try." The man studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You don't understand what you're up against. These loggers, they're not just here for the trees. They're here to take everything." "What do you mean?" Dan asked, stepping forward. The man shook his head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you get out of here before it's too late." Before Emily could respond, the dog let out a low growl, its gaze fixed on something behind them. Emily turned, her breath catching as she saw several loggers approaching, their expressions dark. "You're trespassing," one of them said, his voice sharp. "You need to leave. Now." Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding. "We're researchers," she said. "This forest is home to an endangered species, and we're here to protect it." The logger snorted. "Endangered species won't pay my bills. You've got 5 minutes to pack up and get out, or we'll make you leave." The confrontation ended with the group retreating to their camp, their nerves frayed. Emily paced back and forth, her mind racing. They were running out of time, and the loggers were closing in. But she refused to give up. "We need to make a stand," she said finally. "If we leave now, everything we've done will be for nothing." Dan frowned. "And what do you propose we do? Go back there and get ourselves arrested?" "No," Emily replied. "We take this to the media. We show them what's happening here. The photos, the water samples, the eggs. It's enough to make people listen." Nate looked up from his camera. "Do you think it'll work?" Emily nodded. "It has to. It's our only chance." As the sun set over the forest, the group began preparing to leave, their packs filled with the evidence they had collected. Emily's heart was heavy, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She knew the fight wasn't over, it was only just beginning. And as they left the forest behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man's words would haunt her for a long time. "You're fighting a battle you can't win." But Emily refused to believe that. Because if there was even a chance to save the ghost frog and the forest it called home, she would fight with everything she had. The forest stood in heavy silence, its once vibrant energy now subdued under the weight of looming destruction. Emily, Nate, and Dan were back in the city, the sights and sounds of urban life jarring after their days spent in the remote wilderness. But there was no time to reflect. They had a mission: to bring the story of the ghost frog and its threatened habitat to the world. Emily sat at a large wooden table in the headquarters of a local environmental organization, surrounded by maps, photographs, and her grandfather's journal. Across from her sat Clara Morales, a well-known environmental lawyer who had agreed to help their cause. Clara was sharp, her eyes scanning every detail of the evidence Emily had brought. "This is strong," Clara said finally, placing the photographs back on the table. "The images of the frogs, the eggs, the poisoned water, it's enough to get people's attention. But it won't be enough to stop the loggers outright." Emily leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "Then what will?" Clara adjusted her glasses. "We need a court injunction to halt the logging operations. To get that, we'll need public pressure and official recognition of the ghost frog as a critically endangered species. That means going to the media, rallying public support, and filing petitions with the state's environmental agency." Dan, seated beside Emily, crossed his arms. "How long will all that take?" "The loggers aren't going to wait." Clara gave him a measured look. "That depends on how quickly we can move. If we play this right, we might be able to stop them before they do irreversible damage. But it's going to take a lot of effort, and a little luck." Emily nodded, her determination unwavering. "Then let's get to work." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Emily and Nate presented their findings to journalists, environmental groups, and local government officials. Clara helped draft petitions and prepare legal documents, while Dan coordinated with local rangers to monitor the logging operations. The media coverage began slowly: an article in a regional paper, a short segment on a local news station. But as more people learned about the ghost frog and the fight to save its habitat, the story gained traction. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #SaveTheGhostFrog and #ProtectOurForests, and environmental activists began organizing protests near the logging sites. Emily watched it all unfold with a mix of hope and anxiety. The photographs of the ghost frog, coupled with Nate's haunting images of the scarred forest, were captivating. But she knew that public opinion could only do so much. They needed action. One evening, Emily received a call from Clara. Her voice was calm but firm, tinged with urgency. "We've got a hearing," Clara said. "The court has agreed to review our request for an injunction against the logging company. It's scheduled for next week." Emily's heart raced. "That's great news." "It is," Clara agreed. "But we need to be prepared. The logging company is going to argue that they have all the necessary permits and that the forest isn't home to any protected species. We need to prove otherwise." "I'll be ready," Emily said without hesitation. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation. Emily pored over her notes, refining her presentation with Clara's help. Nate compiled the best photographs into a slideshow, while Dan provided maps and data to show the extent of the logging's impact. The night before the hearing, the group gathered in a small conference room to rehearse their case. Emily stood at the front, her grandfather's journal in one hand and a laser pointer in the other. She spoke with passion, her voice steady despite the weight of their mission. "The ghost frog isn't just a symbol of this forest's biodiversity," she said. "It's a reminder of what we stand to lose if we don't take action. This forest isn't just trees and streams. It's a home, a sanctuary, and a critical part of our ecosystem. We have a responsibility to protect it." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before Clara nodded approvingly. "You're ready," she said. "Now let's hope the judge sees it that way too." The hearing took place in a modest courthouse on the edge of the city. The room was filled with reporters, activists, and representatives from the logging company. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table with Clara, Nate, and Dan by her side. The logging company's lawyers sat across from them, their expressions impassive. The proceedings began with opening statements, each side laying out their arguments. The logging company emphasized their compliance with permits and the economic benefits of their operations. Clara countered with a passionate plea for the forest's preservation, supported by Emily's evidence. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and approached the podium. She began with the photographs, showing the judge images of the ghost frog, its eggs, and the damaged habitat. She spoke about the poisoned water and the long-term consequences of losing the forest. Finally, she opened her grandfather's journal and read a passage he had written decades ago. "To lose a species is to lose a piece of ourselves." Each one is a thread in the tapestry of life, and when one thread is pulled, the whole fabric begins to unravel. When she finished, the room was silent. Emily returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had done everything she could. Now, it was up to the judge. The decision came a week later. Emily was at the environmental organization's headquarters when Clara called. "We did it," Clara said, her voice filled with relief. The judge granted the injunction. The logging operations are on hold until further notice. Emily sank into a chair, her eyes filling with tears. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." The victory was bittersweet. While the injunction was a significant step, Emily knew it wasn't the end. There would be more battles ahead. More hearings, more petitions, more work to ensure the ghost frog and its habitat were permanently protected. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Back in the forest, Emily, Nate, and Dan returned to the stream where it had all begun. The air was fresh, the sound of chainsaws replaced by the gentle babble of water. As they stood by the bank, Emily spotted a ghost frog perched on a rock, its translucent body glowing faintly in the sunlight. "It's still here," she said softly. "They're still here." Nate raised his camera, capturing the moment with a quiet click. Dan crossed his arms, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did good, Doc," he said. "We all did." Emily nodded, her heart full. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the ghost frog was safe. And that was enough.